My name is Tanner Anderson. I am one of the co-founders of Magic Hour Entertainment. Welcome to our YouTube channel, and please don't forget to subscribe along. And why don't we all go on a journey right now? Why don't we count down the most bankable actors of the 1950s? And I want to let you know that I calculated this list by using information reported by the Motion Picture Almanac. The man who made famous the method approach to acting, making him somewhat of a polarizing figure on Broadway prior to his film debut in 1951 in the iconic movie A Streetcar Named Desire, which turned Marlon Brando into a movie star overnight. But Brando's approach to acting was somewhat unconventional. We had never seen anyone act on film that decided to give a naturalistic approach to his work. He learned from Stella Adler, who learned from Stanislavski, and their whole thing was to make it feel as grounded as possible. So Marlon Brando, oftentimes while on set, he'd be having small talk, small conversations with the cameraman, the crew, other cast members while in character. And the director, he would yell action, but Brando, he wouldn't stop his conversations. He'd be like, hey man, how's your girlfriend? Hey, how was your weekend? And he wanted to give this naturalistic feel. And when he felt grounded and just right, he would begin with the dialogue for the script. And whatever he was doing, it was the first time that Hollywood had ever seen this kind of acting on film before. And he is inarguably the greatest start to a movie star's career in the history of Hollywood. 4 of the first 5 movies he was the lead in, Marlon Brando was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Lead Actor, winning in 1958 for On the Waterfront. In fact, of those 5 movies, the only one that he wasn't nominated for an Academy Award for Best Lead Actor was for The Wild Bunch, which, looking back, might be one of his most iconic performances of his entire career. Before Sydney Sweeney existed, there was Marilyn Monroe, an actress who didn't sign a contract with Fox until 1950, but a mere 3 years after signing that deal, she exploded into movie stardom. But it almost didn't happen in the first place because there was a giant scandal at the beginning of her career that almost derailed everything. Because in 1949, she decided that she was going to pose nude for a calendar. And at the time, a movie star, they were not allowed to do this. So the studio, they told Marilyn Monroe to lie about it, to deny that it was her. But she refused to do that, publicly stating that it was in fact her that posed nude for this calendar. But she did it because she was so down on her luck that she needed the money in order to make ends meet. And this was so relatable to people that it gave her public sympathy and it made her into an even bigger star. And then in 1954, she married one of the biggest baseball players in the entire world in Joe DiMaggio. And suddenly, her personal life, it became bigger than her career, despite in 1955, her releasing the classic movie The 7-Year Itch, which made more than 10 times its budget. In fact, throughout the 1950s, she averaged nearly 3 pictures per year, with the studio paying her $100,000 per movie and allowing her to pick the projects that she wanted to be associated with and the directors who would direct those projects. And this was so unheard of at the time, and it led to some of her best work, like 1958's Some Like It Hot. But unfortunately, as her star grew, her personal life in the tabloids, it grew even larger, with affairs with the likes of Marlon Brando, President John F. Kennedy, and then eventually writer Arthur Miller, overshadowing her incredible acting run. The most famous leading lady of her time, often starring in films alongside Hollywood's biggest stars, from James Cagney to Kirk Douglas to Frank Sinatra, Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, Rock Hudson, and many more. I just can't name them off the top of my head. But Doris Day, she did not get her big break until 1945. But it wasn't her acting that caught the entertainment industry's attention. No, she was the lead singer of a big band that went on to have 2 #1 singles. This got her discovered, so she started acting in musicals. And she was named by Billboard magazine the best female vocalist in the entire world on 9 different occasions in 10 years from 1949 to 1958. But her big break in film, it would occur in 1956 when she starred in Alfred Hitchcock's classic film, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And her performance in that film, It had audiences gravitating towards Doris Day because, frankly, she sounded normal. She was grounded. She was one of them. She had an ability to express complex emotions in a simple way, or as I like to say, she had an ability to act without showing the work. Bob Hope is one of the greatest comedians to ever live, but we don't really give him a ton of credit for being a genius. This guy, his jokes were so self-deprecating that it allowed us as the audience to laugh at him because he had no problem laughing at himself, so it disarmed us. Plus, on top of that, he was like Robin Williams, this unbelievable comedian who was also a great dramatic actor. He starred in 54 films from 1938 to 1972. 7 of them were with Bing Crosby, and Bing Crosby, he was arguably one of the greatest movie stars in the history of Hollywood. And the two of them, they were so compatible together. They were so relatable. They had this unbelievable chemistry that audiences absolutely loved. But in 1972, Bob Hope, he decided that he was just going to retire from acting because he wanted to focus full-time on hosting and doing more television, which he did. And the thing that I remember most about Bob Hope was he was the first guy who would go overseas and perform for the troops, doing so from 1941 to 1991 on 57 different occasions. Plus, he is also arguably the greatest host in the history of the Academy Awards. He emceed that show for the Oscars on 19 different occasions during his career. Glenn Ford should have become a movie star long before he actually became a movie star, because in 1941, he had his breakout role by portraying a German exile who was trying to flee Nazi Germany, but in a strange twist of fate, art imitating life, 1942 rolled around and the Japanese, they decided to bomb Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden the United States was involved in World War II, and old Glenn Ford, he's now serving his country in the Marine Corps from 1942 to 1946. So this guy's movie star career, it had a 4-year hiatus. But when he returned from the conflict in 1946, the movie Gilda did in fact turn him into a movie star overnight. And audiences, they absolutely loved Glenn Ford because he seemed like an ordinary guy that was always finding himself in unordinary circumstances. And he had a really good taste with the movies that he picked. 5 of his films have been selected to the Library of Congress for preservation. 3 of those films, they were made during the 1950s. The other 2 was Gilda in 1946 and Superman in 1978, because I don't know if you know this, sports fans, Glenn Ford, he played Clark Kent's father in that film. There is nobody in the history of the world that sold more records and had more box office grosses than Bing Crosby had. This dude started over 70 films. He recorded over 1,600 songs from 1926 to 1977. Plus, he is a pioneer in every sense of the word. Every single artist that came after Bing Crosby, they were trying to imitate his style, from Elvis Presley to Dean Martin to Frank Sinatra to John Lennon. Plus, he's often credited with helping the soldiers get through World War II, because the boys, they were stationed overseas, and after a long day of battling, they'd be sitting there listening to the radio, and all of a sudden, Bing Crosby, his soothing voice, it would come on and it would relax them, give them hope, and remind them of home. Plus, he is one of 6 actors ever to be nominated for an Academy Award for portraying the same character in multiple films. And he is the first actor ever to be named the most bankable movie star in Hollywood 5 consecutive years, from 1944 to 1948. That has only happened on one other occasion, with Burt Reynolds from 1978 to 1982. Plus, fun fact, he was also an owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates for 31 years, and he won 2 World Series championships. Rock Hudson was the first celebrity to die of AIDS, passing away in 1984 despite his sexual orientation not being known to the public and just known to a few colleagues and close friends. However, after his AIDS diagnosis became public knowledge, his final performance in the ABC hit show Dynasty, it became heavily scrutinized because in that performance, Rock Hudson, he kisses his co-star, and so little was known about the illness, people feared that by kissing her, Rock Hudson was putting her in jeopardy of contracting the disease. And During the 1950s, Rock Hudson, he was one of Hollywood's biggest heartthrobs. His breakout came in 1954 in The Magnificent Obsession, and then he followed up that performance with 2 consecutive performances where he was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Lead Actor in All That Heaven Allows and Giant, with that former movie Giant being the final on-screen performance by Hollywood icon James Dean. William Holden's best friend was President Ronald Reagan because the two of them, they came up in Hollywood together and were both super active in the Screen Actors Guild. In fact, when President Reagan ended up marrying his wife Nancy, William Holden was his best man, and Nancy's maid of honor was William Holden's wife. In fact, when William Holden died in 1981, President Reagan was still in office and he gave a speech at his funeral. And William Holden, he was such a big deal that from 1954 to 1958, the New York Morning Telegraph named him one of the top 10 movie stars in the world. In fact, the American Film Institute named William Holden one of the top 25 movie stars of all time. He won the Academy Award for Best Lead Actor in 1953. Plus, he had top billing in classic films like Sunset Boulevard and The Bridge to the River Kwai. Gary Cooper could do it all. In fact, he started off his career as an extra and a stunt writer before rising to prominence in silent Western films. However, in 1929, he decided to do his first talkie picture, and that turned him into a movie star overnight. In fact, for 23 consecutive years, Gary Cooper, he was named one of the top 10 film stars in the entire world. And for 18 consecutive years, he was named one of the top 10 most bankable stars in the entire world. Audiences, they absolutely loved his understated acting style and his quiet strength. He won 2 Academy Awards for Best Lead Actor, and in 1939, right after the Great Depression ended and right before World War II started, Gary Cooper was so popular that he was clearing over $11 million a year by today's standards. In fact, he was such a big star, he was one of the few people that had any leverage as an actor within the studio system, to the point that he actually ended up suing Paramount to get out of his contract, and he won that lawsuit, forever changing Hollywood in the process. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis met in 1945. 1 year later, they debuted as a stage duo. 10 years to the date of them beginning their entertainment marriage, the two of them, they broke up, never to perform together ever again. In fact, their rise to fame and fortune, it was so fast and furious, it almost doesn't feel real, because they got their start in nightclubs, then they transitioned to radio, and just 3 years after beginning in 1949, they signed a movie contract with Paramount to star in films, getting paid $75,000 per picture, which is about the equivalent of $1 million today. And just 2 years after signing that contract, 5 years after they began together, they were the highest paid act in the entire world. And from 1951 to 1956, they did 16 movies together. However, on the production of that last film, two of them, they began to have tension. So much so that they decided that after the picture wrapped, they were going to go their separate ways. But they wanted to end things where it began. So on July 25th, 1956, Martin and Lewis, they did one final performance together to say goodbye to their fans. And after the show, they went backstage, they shook hands, they thanked each other for the time together, and they went their separate ways. They didn't speak to one another for another 20 years after that. It's a Wonderful Life is the greatest Christmas movie ever. You guys can argue with me in the comments if you want, but that's just my personal opinion, with Love Actually being a close second. Now that might be a bit more controversial, but Jimmy Stewart, he was the everyman with his distinctive drawl. He epitomized the American ideal during the mid-20th century, and his breakout, it came in 1938 in Frank Capra's iconic comedy, You Can't Take It With You, and this turned him into a movie star. In fact, in 1940, he won the Academy Award for Best Lead Actor. However, in 1941, Jimmy Stewart, he decided to enlist in the U.S. Air Force. So from 1941 to 1947, he was an active member of the United States military, so he didn't make any movies. Therefore, when he returned to the silver screen, it was highly anticipated. And during the 1950s, he leaned heavily on his collaboration with director Alfred Hitchcock. In fact, during that decade, the two of them, they made classic films such as Rear Window, Vertigo, Rope, and The Man Who Knew Too Much. Plus, on top of that, outside of his collaborations with Alfred Hitchcock, Jimmy Stewart in the decade, he starred in The Spirit of St. Louis and The Greatest Show on Earth. The greatest acting career in the history of Hollywood, it all happened by accident because John Wayne, he originally wanted to go to the U.S. Naval Academy, but when he applied, he was rejected because he didn't have the grades, so he ended up accepting a football scholarship from the University of Southern California. But one day, him and his buddies, they wanted to go body surfing in the Pacific Ocean, and John Wayne, he ended up getting injured so badly that he could no longer play football, so he lost his scholarship. So now he's no longer in school and he needs a job, so he ends up working for Fox as an extra and a stunt writer. And Fox, they saw something in the young man, so they decided that they were going to offer him a contract, and he began making appearances in small roles in B movies, and audiences, they really liked his demeanor. They connected with him because he kind of epitomized the frontier heritage of our nation, and so they started putting him in all of these westerns, and that is why John Wayne was always in westerns throughout his career. In fact, he made appearances in 179 different movies and television productions. And in the 1950s, his biggest movie by far was Searchers in 1956, co-starring Jimmy Stewart, who is number 2 on this list.